Gaza is essentially a refugee camp. It's people who lived in what is now called Israel, who were expelled from their homes, pushed out. Obviously, people moved across the world, but Gaza is a specific space where a lot of the refugees settled.
Welcome back to the Born Free podcast. My name is Khumo Kumalo, and today we're going to be speaking about things that pertain to South Africa but are outside of South Africa. But we're going to be talking about a very pressing issue. We're going to be talking about Palestine and particularly what's been happening, because it's a severe situation and it's pretty detrimental. It's pretty dire. And today we're going to be unpacking what's been happening, South Africa's involvement, and all that is. Ammarah, how are you doing today?
Hi, I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing good. So you're from the Palestine Solidarity Alliance. There's a lot that's happened over this last 2 years, if I was to say so. Firstly, there was the Wits encampment that happened last year. And then secondly, there's been all the developments that have happened up until this place. To what we know at this moment, Israel, of course, is moving to, in some extent, moving to an occupation of Gaza and what's particularly happening in Palestine. There's growing calls for individuals to say that there ought to be a ceasefire and that there ought to be an end to the conflict. But I want to particularly start at an interesting place, and particularly where South Africa was involved. I want to start at the universities, because what I read from the university standpoint was, firstly, there's many South African universities which have a tie to not Palestinian institutions, Israeli institutions or companies that are in support of Israel. And that was a very big push, particularly from the Palestinian movements that were on the ground and from students, to say that there should be a divestment. Particularly starting from that point, can you explain to us what people think the responsibility is of these institutions and where these organizations have particularly engaged?
For sure, yeah. So it's a bit of a roundabout explanation, but there has been now quite a few universities that actually do have links with Palestinian institutions, I think because the need is obviously growing. In terms of connections to Israel and Israeli institutions, companies, or just companies that are complicit in the occupation and genocide, that is pretty much ubiquitous across the world. So there's not many universities that have no ties with Israel or Israeli institutions. I guess you would think and hope that like South Africa would take the model stance and know who to cooperate with and who to stay away from. But in a sense, the bigger problem is that university spaces have become very corporatized and commercialized spaces. So there's a lot of corporate funding that universities accept, and that can come from a variety of sources. There's a lot of really awkward and inappropriate relationships with maybe families that might donate a lot of money, who have particular agendas. And then there's the actual institutions. And what the basic call for divesting and cutting ties with Israeli institutions, what that means is based on the fact that Israeli universities and pretty much all of Israeli society is set up specifically to maintain the occupation, to maintain the genocide, to maintain the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. So it's kind of like if people were, if there was like an apartheid university in South Africa and that university's goal would be to create research to maintain the apartheid year. And that's not like a fictional kind of scenario. That is literally what these universities are created for. A lot of the students would do research projects where they're developing tech that's then used for surveillance, specifically on Palestinians. A lot of them are in weapons development, military research, and it's all kind of aimed at trying to make sure that Palestinian freedom is more and more impossible. So when universities in South Africa have ties with institutions like that, I mean, it just kind of makes people think, like, what actually am I going to university for? Historically, universities have been a more liberal space where people can essentially like learn what it means to be politically involved, what it means to be on the right side of history and look at things a bit critically. And when you're in a university space where that's not allowed because you have funders that are maybe Zionists or you've got links to complicit institutions, it makes it really hard for the university space to actually be politically free. Yeah. And that's kind of the essence of why the student encampment started. In the US, obviously, it was the biggest there because their universities actually invest in different companies in order to like make money to run the place. And a lot of the investments by the universities are into things like weapons and arms and the military, and surveillance. So that was the biggest call there. In South Africa, the funding situation is a little bit different, but we still have a lot of ties with Israeli institutions and universities.
Yeah. I think what's the most interesting, particularly for what's happening now, is that it takes me back quite significantly to what was happening during the time in Vietnam, where university campuses were kind of the epicenter of protest, or kind of the epicenter of discourse and conversations. And I think what's been the most interesting out of all of that is particularly both the response internally in South Africa and the response externally. You've mentioned the United States, and of course, a lot of those universities have gone through torment. A lot of students have necessarily been arrested as a result of the things that they stand for. But particularly in South Africa, I think what I found the most interesting was we had a government that was actively prosecuting individuals at the ICJ, and we had universities kind of responding in a completely different manner. And many people were kind of disappointed by the university's responses of not being willing to divest from many of these institutions and actually saying that they want to affirm their ties. But particularly to how this conversation has happened on South African campuses and where you are, I want to necessarily understand what has been the university's response, but also how much freedom have you guys been granted to say what you want and to speak freely about the plight that's happening in Palestine?
Yeah, so I mean, personally, I had left university already by the time like October 2023. So I haven't been involved in like the organizing of the encampments, but of course, as a solidarity movement, we're all kind of linked with each other and trying to support each other. The Wits one specifically was called the Wits Liberated Zone, and that was organized by like many different movements, but had like a very central theme of liberation, decolonization, and just trying to make sure that we bring in all different issues across the globe centered on what's happening in Palestine. And I think what we saw there was the same response we saw at Fees Must Fall, same response that we've seen even the apartheid police enact on Black South Africans, which is just like immense brutality. And those encampments were like squashed in ways that like the images of people's things being confiscated, or police officers and private security coming onto campus with weapons and with like batons and intimidating students, and universities calling in some of the organizers and telling them, we'll pay off your outstanding debt if you promise to stop this encampment. Like those were the kinds of politics that were happening behind the scenes, which is so sinister. And as you said, in South Africa, we have like more than enough freedom to say what we want to say and to support who we want to support. But it seems that a lot of these institutions are just way more hesitant to do that because, I mean, sometimes it's their own vested interests, sometimes they just don't care enough. But it has to do with the role of university actually being, you just come here to get a degree and then don't make trouble. That's kind of what you're supposed to do nowadays. And it was particularly devastating, I think, to see, again, like security forces just demolishing things that students had worked really hard to build, like the sense of community. And there were different tents, different spots. There was like relaxing zones. There was like artist zones. And you could see that people were creating a sense of community. And that was physically removed. But I think the deeper problem is that is being removed in general across the world.
Yeah, and I think looking at this conflict has been relatively interesting, right? Because from October 7th, 2023, there was, I don't want to say a universal agreement, but I think there was a universal understanding that Hamas at that specific instance had done something wrong. And I think this then splintered how the world looked at this conflict for the rest of time. There was individuals who were able to recognize that Hamas was actually responding to years of oppression that they've been dealing with, and occupation and abuse that's come particularly at the hands of the Netanyahu administration and Israel as a whole. But then there's the other side of people who said, no, these people are terrorists, these people are bad, and everyone essentially is a terrorist. And I think that's a very interesting narrative because, once again, I feel like, particularly in South Africa, but even globally, we're split on a very simple issue, which should be about humans, which should be about the human suffering that's going on. Because particularly if you fast forward to where we are now, and you think everyone's kind of calling it a genocide at this point. The threats of famine are kind of growing quite significantly, the denial of aid. And from an international standpoint, the UN's even come out to say that they actively need to get the support and get the aid on the ground to ensure people don't go through the amount of suffering. Particularly how you guys have engaged this as the PSA. What has been the thing that you think people haven't necessarily understood about this conflict? But also, what do you think is the thing or the nuance that people are missing in the conflict, which leads them to then necessarily not noting the humanitarian suffering or the degrees of suffering that are happening as a result of the Israeli government?
I think there's a few kind of reasons. The first would ironically probably be referencing it as a conflict, which is something that everyone I think did, maybe knowingly, maybe unknowingly, I'm not sure. But that's been a narrative that's been purposely pushed in order to make it seem like it's just these two groups of people that can't seem to get along and we don't know why. And that kind of narrative, I think, fell apart in the months after October 7th. But at the same time, everyone that, might have heard about Hamas for the first time on October 7th, essentially they've missed plus 75 years of history. And so people who start at Hamas, Hamas is one of the newest organizations, like resistance movements in Palestine. And it's a lot of the people are young there because many of them have seen other movements try their luck at getting freedom for Palestine and have either seen them sell out or be completely decimated. So Hamas is just the latest movement, but it's not the only one, and it's not unique in what it's trying to do. Wherever there is oppression, people will resist. That's a fact of life and a historical fact. So I think people that were surprised that October 7th happened would not have known any of the context before. And I think at that point, it should have been a wake-up call to say, okay, I've missed out on the history. Let me check what that is.
Yeah.
For a lot of people, they just saw the images or the stories or heard testimony and they just ran with that and carried on. Not to say that there wasn't atrocities committed, but a lot of the testimony has now been proven false. So the stories of beheaded babies and mass rapes, all of that has been debunked. But the noise that was made when that was a claim compared to when the facts were discovered is completely different. Just like the accusation just carried on and on and on. And that still remains something that I think, people are rightfully scared to dismiss atrocities and to dismiss human rights abuses. And so that's why it's easy to say, okay, who committed them? Hamas. Okay, that makes Hamas bad. And then full stop. That's an easy way of working through what's actually very complicated. So to understand what got Hamas to that point, and obviously I'm not a spokesperson for them, which, pretty much every pro-Palestine person has been accused of being. What got them to that point is essentially when people are completely squashed in an area that's being controlled entirely by the military, an area where you can't move freely, where, as we've seen, you can't decide how much you eat because you're not in charge of those borders, you're not in charge of the land, you're not in charge of production, you're literally not in charge of anything to do with your own life. When you keep squashing people and making that area smaller and smaller and smaller, eventually things are going to explode, literally. And in my ideal world, we wouldn't get to that point, but we are at that point because there's been this purposeful ignorance for 75 plus years. And I think in South Africa specifically, there's a few things, I think, going on. On the one hand, at least in our engagements as the PSA, we find that ordinary South Africans can very easily see themselves in Palestine. And that's linked to what Archbishop Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela and others said very explicitly about our struggles are linked and we're not free until Palestine's free, because the apartheid government started in 1948. 1948 is also the year Israel got its independence, which is also the year of the Nakba when Palestinians were expelled. And so there is this parallel life where the apartheid government in South Africa and the Israeli government were essentially sharing tips, trying to figure out how do we do this thing of trying to make us as a minority of people control a majority of people who are not part of our group. So yeah, there is, when you explain that kind of context to the ordinary South African, I think that clicks pretty well. That's not a difficult thing to explain. What we've found that's been like a bit harder to deal with or address is obviously South Africa has millions of problems. And so there is kind of an urge for people to say, okay, it may or may not be a genocide, but what am I supposed to do about it? Like, I'm trying to feed my family. I'm trying to get a job. I haven't worked for 15 years. And I think that is maybe what the next challenge is for us as solidarity movements, because those issues are very much linked. It's part of the same global system. And it's not, we care more about Palestinians right now and we'll care about you as a Black South African later. It's actually, we're all kind of fighting the same fight if we just look at the details a little bit more. And that's been a bit harder to do. And that's where like trade unions and labor movements, and even the government to an extent, has been helpful in helping us get that narrative, because it's essentially trying to join two groups of people who shouldn't be divided into one. And that's been interesting, but that's, I think, the most important work to do. And then you get like the third group of people who are either like just incredibly racist towards like Muslims and Arabs, or people who just don't really care that much. And that has been the worst, I think, to deal with, because I don't know if you've ever tried to force people to care about something, but it's the most like unrewarding work ever, because not even because like they are the ones suffering from poverty, but just because okay, it's far. What must we do? Like, it's not our business. Or, you know, we don't want to be anti-Semitic, and so we just won't say anything. But there is obviously an important way of speaking about Israel's atrocities without being anti-Semitic. And that's just a skill that people learn. As you get more into the history, you understand. So it's kind of that refusal of wanting to look at anything because you're scared of being controversial or of having your previous ideas challenged. And that's been the most insanely difficult part of all of this, because I still don't know how you open up people's eyes who are just like, nope, I've decided this is what I'm going to be. I don't care if it's ignorant. It's better for me this way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think with there being so many terms, particularly when it comes to this conflict, at times it's hard for everyone to make sense of particularly what's happening. And I thought this is the most interesting one, is the difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and how those two things have been conflated, and particularly how it's been hard to separate people who are for the Palestinian people but against an Israeli state, if they're not necessarily looking at a two-state solution. And particularly when you've engaged those nuances, and particularly when we're engaging communities which both have history where they've been victims as a result of certain systems of oppression, both have histories of violence against each other, there's quite a lot of tension and emotion that's actually built into this conflict that a lot of people don't necessarily see. And I think it's fair to not say it's a conflict, but more into the history of these two groups that exist in the same place and same land. And I want to particularly understand what the PSA's stance is, because is it to say that they are for a two-state solution, they're against a Zionist state as being argued for at the moment? Is it to say that they actually are for potentially a sharing of states, where there's a secular government that rules over the entire area? What particularly is that solution? But secondly, how have you guys navigated people saying that naturally being anti-Zionist means that you have to be anti-Semitic and you're against the Jewish right to their own independent land and their own protection that they call for?
Yeah, so I think on the first one, I mean, we only take our kind of demands directly from whatever the Palestinians have said explicitly. So the PSA is part of the South African BDS coalition, which is the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement. And that, basically all the BDS in every single country is linked to the National Committee, the BNC, which is made up of Palestinian civil society. And so our like political stances in that sense come directly from there. And as far as I know, I mean, there hasn't been a kind of like consensus gathering process, at least since October 7th, on where Palestinians where their political aims are, what they think should happen with the states and the borders.
Yeah.
But regardless of whether it's 2 states or 1 or 15 states, I think Zionism at its core is not something that we think is tenable with human rights. And that's not because it's anti-Semitic, not because we're anti-Semitic, it's because Zionism is a purely political project that has absolutely nothing to do with Judaism at its core. And I mean, that's been proven in its content of like what Zionism stands for, but also by the massive groups of Jewish people who have come out to say, nope, this is not representing us. This is not what our religion has taught us. This is just a political goal. And I think it's similar to how like colonization and even apartheid in South Africa, how they used religions to kind of get people on board. But anyone that cared to look a little bit deeper could see, actually, you're not really doing your religion. You're just saying you are because you need a motivation for whatever other political goal you have. And so, like the Zionist project, the history of it is so revealing when it comes to this conflation between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Zionism as a project was like theorized long before World War II. So it was literally called like a colonial project. That's not a secret. That's like in its founding documents. And the idea was that, yeah, to some extent, people thought, okay, the Jews need their homeland, and the homeland being where historically they lived. And there are some things about that land being promised to Jewish people, but being promised to you versus like requiring you to like murder Palestinians is like two very different things. And here you kind of see the similarities between how the United States was created with the whole like manifest destiny. It is our, like, it's the instruction from God that we must kill all the Native Americans and take over the Americas. Like, it's trying to use something that's deeper than just, we just want to kill them because we want land. Like, that doesn't sound like a good sell. You know, you need to have a bigger narrative there. And there was anti-Semitism, especially in Europe, which I guess gave credence to this idea of, okay, Jews do need to be safe. There were Jews living in Palestine before Zionism, Jewish people, Christians, Muslims living in relative harmony for decades before Zionism came. But what Zionism specifically wanted was, how do you create a Jewish state in an area that has a minority of Jews? And that's why the parallels of apartheid South Africa are so clear, because it's like, oh, you can't unless you use force, unless you use displacement, unless you use ethnic cleansing and genocide, because the actual numbers, like if they had a vote with everyone that lives in Palestine, they would of course be outnumbered. You can't have like a proper democracy there. Just in terms of numbers, if people are not going to vote for you.
Yeah.
And so that's why, like, that's the motivation for why you need to expel people from their land. But there's also this idea of Europeans wanting to create essentially a colony in the Middle East for their own interests. And this was now, like, before the USA was the player that it is now. It was mainly like Britain, France, Germany to an extent, who wanted someone that was going to represent their interests in the Middle East, because all of the Middle Eastern countries were obviously not impressed by what the West was doing. And so they needed people who were going to essentially be like diplomats, is basically what it was. Like, you know, you're going to report back to us, but you're in that land and, you know, you make sure our interests are served. And that's clearly in the documents that like explain what Zionism is. And that's clearly in the documents where the British said, we're giving this land that was not theirs to give to the Jews. But it's clear that it's not just any Jews. It's clear that it's the Jews who specifically are going to carry out this like Western idea of what it means to be civilized. And then obviously once World War II happened, which granted was an historical atrocity that we should never forget, that kind of gave the final push to say, okay, actually, as Jewish people, let's go quickly. Before then, Zionism was not really something that people were interested in.
Okay.
And once, I mean, of course, if you're getting genocided, you will consider all of your options.
Yeah.
So since then is when it's become like the only way Jewish people can prevent another Holocaust happening is to go to Palestine and occupy it, which doesn't make sense. Like, that's not a logical conclusion, but it's become so internalized that a lot of people feel like if you say Jews shouldn't have a homeland, you're saying Jews should die.
Yeah.
You're saying Jews should be killed. You're saying Jews don't deserve to live. And that's like, no, that's a completely different sentence. What are you talking about? And that is like strategic. A lot of the Jews that live in Israel now are from Western countries that were invaded by the Nazis. So like a lot of people historically from Poland. The current prime minister is actually from Poland. And there's a lot of people from the US, but basically it's mostly Europeans that live now in Israel. And so I think that should have given people the signal of like, it's a place that's calling itself a friend of the West. It's a place that's now dominated by people from the West. It's funded entirely by the West. I wonder what their interests are. Like, it's quite simple to see that this is essentially a colony. A colonial like outpost is basically what it is. But I mean, in Jewish scripture, and obviously I'm not a scholar, but in Jewish scripture, the idea of like Jews living together in one place is actually not something that Jews are supposed to do. They're supposed to live in like diaspora until, there's the next step, which is not done by them. It's like a divine step that's given. And so the idea of like going there, invading, killing people is very anti-Jewish. And I think what's been done in the name of Zionism is clearly anti-Jewish as well. There's things like the Hannibal Directive, which is if we see people in a specific area that we deem need to be killed, we'll kill all of them. We don't care if it's Israelis. We don't care if it's Jewish people. We don't care because they are targets and that's all they are to us. And that's a policy they've admitted they've used even on October 7th. So when we look at like the death toll, a lot of the people that were murdered were killed by Israel. If you look at the pictures of the destruction, like the kinds of explosives, Palestinians don't have access to those explosives. You can see like, oh, this is caused by this type of bomb, which only Israel has. So there's a lot of contradictions in the Zionism equals Judaism conflation. And once you see that, it kind of all unravels for you and you understand, okay, not only can I be anti-Zionist and, still love Jews and think they should live, but actually it's very important that I do that. Because if I say all Jews equal Zionists, then I'm saying all Jews are like murderers of babies or are willing to genocide people for land or are willing to, serve in the army and commit all kinds of atrocities and video it and make TikToks about it. Yeah. And that feels like, surely not. Surely you can't say that about like a religious group. So I think once you get at the logic of, the lack of logic in like Zionism equals Judaism, that kind of helps people see the difference. Yeah. But I mean, to be fair, the biggest group of Zionists is actually Christian Zionists. And so, I mean, but you can't call anti-Zionist anti-Christian because you understand how silly that sounds. But that's, again, like evangelical Christians specifically, who have this idea that Jews need to go back to the land in order for the Messiah to arrive. And that will also lead to the destruction of Jews. And like, that feels very anti-Semitic. So it's like this conflation that's purposely and very smartly done. And it needs us to be a little bit brave in thinking beyond what we just see or beyond what people want us to see and then stop. We need to just push a little bit further.
Yeah. I think genocide's an interesting word in the 21st century, right? If you're in South Africa, there's apparently white genocide. In Palestine, it's of course just genocide. You can clearly see that. But then there's also the history of genocide that is closely related to Jewish people. And I think the most interesting thing is this idea of two victim entities going against each other. And the reason I say two victim entities is because on one end, as you already said, there's many people within the Jewish community who would say that as a result, Israel was actually created after the genocides that happened in Nazi Germany, and therefore they need the right to protect themselves, they need a state. And interesting, now they're the ones persecuting genocide, not particularly Jewish people, but particularly the Israeli administration. And I'm interested in terms of the shift that's taken place, particularly to this conflict and particularly to what's been happening, because it went from overnight being seen as a conflict to then being seen as a oppressive situation to then being declared a genocide. And that progression has been, firstly, one, very scary, but I think secondly, very saddening in the fact that we haven't heard more international calls for there to be sanctions, there hasn't been international calls for people to end their allyship with Israel. And I think what's correctly identified is that for many of these Western nations, losing Israel as an ally is just not an option for them. They need to have control within the Middle East. It's the best point to get influence and resources, and Israel helps quite a lot with military support to those nations as well. So just from a military standpoint, especially if you're in Europe looking at Russia, Ukraine, there's potentially the inability to say that Israel's not our ally. And I guess the most telling situation of it now is like Macron's not necessarily going to recognize Palestine as a state, and he's likely going to delay that. But particularly around this word genocide, which is, from my understanding, a systemic and institutional way of exterminating individuals, and particularly for what's happening in Palestine. What do you understand of the human suffering that's taking place on the ground? Because it's gone from just it being a bomb here, a bomb there, to now it's gone to actively starving populations. I mean, they say 22% of the population is likely going through a great deal of torment, doesn't have access to food. We still see the active killings of individuals on a daily basis. But particularly when we are speaking about genocide, what's the thing that's made everyone get to that point and to declare this as a genocide?
I think the ICJ ruling kind of gave people permission to call it a genocide. A lot of people were scared of using that word because it's a legal term, obviously. It's like the difference between saying you're a criminal versus you're an alleged criminal.
Yeah.
So once the ICJ said, actually, this is very plausibly a genocide, people felt like, okay, we can use this word without being sued or called an anti-Semite. And that was like a very important step. But I mean, even without the ICJ ruling, to be honest, it was quite clear that was the intention. And there has been a process of ongoing ethnic cleansing for plus 77 years now.
Yeah.
Even Gaza itself, there are very few Palestinians who are historically from Gaza. Gaza is essentially a refugee camp. It's people who lived in what is now called Israel, who were expelled from their homes, pushed out. Obviously, people moved across the world, but Gaza is a specific space where a lot of the refugees settled. So when we speak about, like, there's been bombings at, like, Deir al-Bala refugee camp, like, those are Palestinians who are refugees in Palestine. So that already should tell you, like, okay, this context is not what I thought it was.
Yeah.
And in terms of the suffering, like, it's generational, but it's still ongoing. So a lot of these people will speak about how their great-grandparents kept the keys to their houses in what is now called Israel. Because literally what would happen was, once Israel was declared as a state, the IDF, the army, would literally go to houses like marked as this is going to be a Jewish area now, go into the homes and tell them, we live here now. And it's like, that sounds very fake. But like, this is an actual documented research. And so people would literally have like a few minutes to just pack whatever they could, carry that and flee. And this is like a historical trend where the great-grandparents of Palestinians kept the keys to their front doors because in their mind, they were like, we will return eventually. Might not be me, but someone from my family will return. And that kind of like, I think if you grow up with that, you already know, okay, my life's mission is to make sure my family can go back to whatever their home was or wherever it was. So I think that kind of like growing up in that context is very traumatic already. But then essentially, I mean, if you're 17 in Palestine, you've lived through four conflicts, wars, whatever you want to call it. Like if you're 17 in South Africa, just think about like how far removed 17-year-olds are from like apartheid.
Yeah.
That's like a completely different generation. If you're 17 in Gaza, you've already lived through 4 wars, and many of your friends would have died now in the last 2 years. So that context of like it's ongoing, I think is something that I'd never really expected to see in my lifetime. And it's just been getting worse every single day since October 7th, regardless of what the ICJ says, regardless of what Human Rights Watch says. It feels irrelevant sometimes because they just kind of do whatever they want to do. In terms of like what's been allowed in the, how many mils is this water bottle? This water bottle is 500 mils. So on average, Palestinians get like 3 of these bottles a day. That's how much water, for everything. That's essentially how much water people are getting on average. And the reason is not because Palestinians just kind of don't care about the infrastructure. It's because they never controlled the infrastructure. It's controlled by the military, and if they decide you're not getting water, that's it. It's done. There's food trucks that have been sitting outside for like 3-4 months now because Israel has forced the neighbors of Palestine to just close the borders. There's food that's actually like rotting in trucks that is just across the border where people are starving to death. So the actual like the human toll, I think, is something that I can't fully understand because it hurts too much to even like try and empathize. It's like, surely not. Like, surely this is not the world that we live in, and surely this is not being done by like other humans. In terms of like kids specifically, that I think has been what's been really shocking for me because, I mean, this is not correct, it's not right, but there has been this idea that like men of a certain age in a conflict zone are fair targets. And I don't think that's fair, but that is, I guess, the general global narrative. But there's always been this idea of like women and children are not to be touched. Like you cannot bring them into conflict. And like Israel just doesn't care in a way that I've never seen or heard of, at least in like the modern era. It's very much like everyone's a target, and actually, even if it's kids, that's better because they're going to grow up to be terrorists one day. Like these are things that Israelis have said on camera. And so when you hear about like just the depravity and the regardlessness of children just because they're Palestinian, that shows you like how urgent it is to resolve this. There was a new like medical term that they coined in Palestine in the last 2 years, which is wounded child, no surviving family. It's never happened on a scale where they've needed to make like a medical acronym. But if a kid comes to one of the remaining hospitals in Palestine, they would make that note so many times that they needed to make an acronym for it.
Whoa.
All of the family was killed. The child was wounded, possibly needed like an amputation or some kind of surgery, blood transfusions. And they were brought in by whoever was near them when they were bombed. And none of their parents, none of their siblings, none of their grandparents are alive. And like needing to coin that term that should have been enough. Like that should have been, guys, this is too far now.
Yeah.
That was in 2023 is when they started using that term. And it's obviously still being used now because it hasn't really changed. I just want to reflect on like just how many like children specifically have been killed. But that doesn't presume that everyone that's not a child should have been killed. It's just the amount of children that have been killed is like, it's overwhelming. So as of now, it's about 53,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israel since October 7th. And that's like a relatively conservative estimate. There's still people under the rubble. There's people that no one knows where they are and are most likely dead. Then of that, there's over 18,000 children that have been killed. So the population of Gaza is about 50-ish% children, and it's like just under 40% of them make up the death toll. And that's like, I don't know, like killing one child is not bad enough. You went to 18,000 and you're still going on. And I think that's like, I don't even know what 18,000 children look like. Like if I line them up in a room, I'm trying to think like how big does this room have to be? And then all of them just gone. I mean, some of them not even being one yet. There was a story of twins, their names, I have their names here, Asr and Aisal Muhammad Abu al-Qumsan. They were like 4 days old. And so they were at home with their mom, and the dad went to go get their birth certificates. And when he came back, all of them were dead. The whole building had been like bombed.
Crazy.
And that's like, your kids were 4 days old. They didn't even have a birth certificate. Like, this is the level of, we do not care what we kill as long as people die. That's fine, because they must know we are in control. So that mentality, I think, allowing that is dangerous, not just because it means more Palestinian children will die, but it gives license to other people to act like that as well.
Yeah.
Children are no longer off limits. I don't know what's coming next, but it does feel like this is an advert for what could be. And that should terrify everyone, regardless of where you live.
Yeah. I think it's saddening because, yes, if you read all the reports, everyone will attest to the Israeli government claims to be killing Hamas soldiers, which I guess when then you look into the statistics, which initially the West kind of denied at the onset, and now kind of seems to be dabbling and talking about them, but not necessarily identifying who the people are, what they are. It's a testament to how this conflict as a whole has become, in many ways, lost in nuance and lost in misinformation and almost taken over by this idea of there's certain people who think that they're just outright right in this conflict and that they can't be wrong and that they can't do no wrongdoing. I think where I want to switch gears in closing is you mentioned Christian evangelicals. And I think this is a very interesting point because yesterday, at the time of this recording, the New York Times came out to report that there was Project Esther, which was created by the same people who created Project 2025. But the more interesting idea that came out of that was this belief that there is a very strong Christian backing for the Zionist state that currently exists. And it's actually not Jewish people who are actively pushing for a Zionist state. Now bring in Donald Trump, a person who's been very interesting when it's come to this conflict, initially claiming to be able to bring peace to the world before he stepped into office, then claiming that the Palestinians should move elsewhere to a different country and should seek refuge elsewhere, and then having meetings and envoys with the Middle East and then selling them weapons. If you have a humanitarian concern, the only concern you have is that this conflict is only going to get worse if people are buying weapons and if people are rearming. Because what we understand is a lot of the allies to Hamas were shut down by Israel in the last year or so. But now where we stand, and particularly looking on forward to what's happening in particularly this genocide and particularly in the area, what do you make of Trump's contribution? And where do you think people should necessarily evaluate Trump? Because on one end, and this was the thing I read very, very strongly in America, a lot of the reason why Trump was voted in by people who were pro-Palestine was because they believed the Democrats weren't doing enough. The Joe Biden administration wasn't willing to stop a lot of the enarmament of Israel, and only towards the end of his term did he stop saying that he was going to stop sending weapons, and that was overturned by Trump. But now Trump has come in, and there was hope for change. There was hope for better. There was hope for an improvement. And it's been pretty hard to read what his alignment is. And particularly from your standpoint, how do you view Trump in this conflict? How do you view the role that he plays? And do you think he has more influence than is being credited to, beyond just the ability to say that he believes peace should come and there should be a ceasefire?
I would say that any president of the USA has pretty much all of the power. And that's fundamentally the problem. So even at the UN, when all the other member states vote for sanctions, the US has just vetoed them. The US has just vetoed ceasefires. And that level of power, it was abused by pretty much every president of the USA. But we've seen that specifically now be abused by both parties. And I think that's been shocking, again, probably to people who weren't paying attention. This is what America does. They are an imperial power who will protect their imperial interests, no matter who they have to ally with to do that. And that's, I think, fundamentally what people maybe misunderstood when they said Trump is better than Biden. In my opinion, they both suck. If I was an American, I would not vote for either of them. I wouldn't touch them. They were like better, I think, independent parties, green parties that I would have rather voted for. But I think the dissatisfaction with Biden is because the Democrats actually lied, essentially. They did this thing of like, we care about Palestinians and we don't want war and we love international like humanitarian law and we don't want people to die. And then with the same in the same breath, were then giving more weapons, like billions, if not trillions of dollars to Israel, continuing to say, if they do this, it's a red line, and then they did that, and then nothing changed. And I think people were maybe more frustrated at the lies because the Democrats were pretending to be someone that they were not. And in essence, I think maybe the switch over to Trump is like, he does change his mind a lot. And I think he's not principled as a person, because his goal is always, how do I maintain power or increase power?
Yeah.
Which is what the USA does. Like, in that sense, he's a great American president, because that is literally, he's not pretending that there's something else. Like, it's not a benevolent country. Like, this is what they do. In terms of like what that means for Palestine, honestly, I have no idea. And that's because he's not principled. It's hard to predict when someone is willing to do anything for their own power or their own like personal gain. I've been reading that apparently he's like had some fights with Netanyahu. I don't know if those are like real reports. I don't know if they mean anything, but I think the bigger issue is us as the rest of the world. Do we allow the USA to just continue to be the decider of everything? Like, essentially, they get to decide what history will be, because if they don't want to approve something that the rest of the UN says we should do, they just don't. Even if the UN tells them you have to arrest XYZ if they enter your country, they just don't do it. And no one can stand up to them, regardless of whether it's Biden or Trump or anyone else. And that, like, those power dynamics, I think, for me, are more interesting than who is the president, because there's a fundamental problem with the way that America conducts itself. And it's not just them. I mean, Britain is obviously a big person that's guilty of this and has been for centuries. There's France, there's Germany, there's Italy even. And that, I think those power imbalances is actually what I'm hoping changes, whether it's for Palestine or for the DRC or Sudan. It doesn't really matter what the like push factor is, but something has to change, because if not, we're going to have the same thing again and again and again. We're going to have whoever they are and whatever their models and politics are, if they are backed by the US or the UK or France or Germany, they will do whatever they want to do, because the rest of us have no choice, even though the rest of us is the majority.
Yeah.
That's, I think, what's scarier for me, is people seeing that and thinking, okay, that means I shouldn't even try. Like, that should make you think, oh, I need to organize now. I need to get mobilized, and I need to do whatever I can do in order to make sure that my life is different to what my parents' lives were. Because they might have grown up in a generation where it was normal for that power imbalance to exist. But we surely have to say, we've seen enough. We don't accept this. I mean, young people are the majority again. So, like, it shouldn't be something that's disempowering. It should be something that tells you, actually, I can easily identify, like, who my enemies are, and therefore I can organize against that. It obviously takes work, but I would much rather do that work and hope that it leads to the right direction than not do that work, and then I suffer, you suffer, everyone suffers, because no one is willing to actually stand up and like take a chance on things that are really difficult and require a lot of sacrifice, which we've seen across the world. People have put everything on the line for solidarity in general, for Palestine, for South Africa, for Vietnam. And I think that's actually the kind of like human spirit that we need to be encouraging, and not one of like, if I'm fine and if I've eaten, then it's enough. Even if I live in South Africa, the most unequal country in the world, I'm fine, because I get to go to Santon and buy fancy food every week. Meanwhile, like, Alex is down the road and I'm ignoring that. Like, that mentality, I think, is what needs to fundamentally shift.
Yeah. In closing, what I do want to say is, how do people get involved? How do people help out? And what's the way forward for everyone that does want to say something, does want to do something, and wants to be of assistance?
Yeah, I think that, so there's obviously us as the PSA, and we've got a youth league specifically. And so you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, all of those things. It's at PSA_SA and at PSAYL. So we've got like a lot of events that we plan every week or so. Every week we're outside McDonald's and Coca-Cola on Oxford and Glenhove protesting, picketing. We've been there for more than a year now.
Jeez.
Yeah, and we will be there until Palestine's free. Like, these are the small things that we have to do. But we've also got like lots of events upcoming. There's obviously the Africa Day protest, which is happening on the 24th. And if you go to our social media, you'll see the posters there. What I found very useful about being involved in pro-Palestine activism is how easy it's been to just get involved, because it's urgent and it's not a thing where you need to be like scared of, oh, I've never been to a protest before, and so I don't know anyone, I don't want to go. Like, you literally show up, you find your people, you will find your people. And you'll also find like your own niche. Like, there's creative ways of protesting. There's people who might not want to chant, but they just want to paint a big mural of Palestine. Yeah. There's people who, want to do workshops with kids. There was a film festival this weekend where people were like doing Q&As with some of the filmmakers. And there was like a workshop with Nati Ngubane, who is the artist that made a coloring book about Palestine. Wow. Because he was like, kids need to actually understand what's going on. And so I'm going to make a coloring book. And now he does workshops teaching them, like, this is how you draw a watermelon. This is how you draw the Palestine flag. So it really doesn't matter what your skills and interests are. But if you're keen on anything to do with social justice in South Africa and Palestine and Sudan and Congo and everywhere, you have to get involved. Yeah. You have to get involved. It will help you feel better, and it is making a difference. That's why in other countries people are being suppressed for that type of work. It's because it actually works.
I want to say thank you very much. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. I think, this conversation has been tough, and it's the second time I've done this. I thought we would be in a better place the first time I did this, but I think there's a lot to be said. I think there's a lot of suffering globally. There's a lot of suffering in Palestine. And I guess the comment to everyone is kind of to just remember that there's humans, it's human beings, regardless of what their race be, what their religion be. And worst of all, it's kids, man. It's kids who have dreams, kids who have aspirations, who want to live a life, who want to know what a childhood is like. But to everyone else, as always, this has been Born Free. And from Born Free itself, free Palestine.